For 2021, Toyota has made a few tweaks to their successful Highlander crossover, the most noticeable of which is the model that I'm standing right next to. It's the new Highlander XSE. Starting at $42,480, this slots between the XLE and the Limited in the Highlander lineup, and it gives you a sportier appearance, more dynamic suspension, and the ability to get red leather. Rather unfortunately, Toyota did not send me an XSE with the red leather option, and I'm really sad about that because in the pictures it looks really, really good, and if I were going to buy a Highlander, that's certainly the model that I would want. The biggest change for the XSE trim happens up front, where we get a new bumper design, a new grille design that definitely looks more distinctive than we find in the rest of the Highlander lineup, and a new grille down below with these sort of frowny inserts on each side. We have full LED headlights, but they do change based on the model that you get. I was unsure exactly how an XSE would fit into the Highlander lineup, but I have to say I like this front-end design more than the rest of the Toyota Highlander lineup. Not that there's anything wrong with the other Highlander trims, but honestly, the front-end design that we find in the rest of the Highlander lineup looks a little bit more Subaru than Toyota to my eye. Obviously, the bulk of the Highlander remains the same, so this is still on the small side for a three-row crossover in the US. If you're really interested in something with a large and accommodating third row, you probably shouldn't be looking at a Highlander. You should be looking at some of the larger three-row crossovers out there, like the Telluride or the Palisade. On the inside, we have very similar room to the other small crossovers in this segment, like the Acadia and, of course, the Honda Pilot. Additional changes for the XSE trim include unique wheels, a body kit all the way around the vehicle, and revised suspension tuning. So the suspension is a little bit different than we find in the rest of the Highlander lineup, but it's not a massive shift. Out back, we have lightly smoked combination tail lamps, so most of the elements you'll see are LEDs, but the turn signal and the backup lights are incandescent. At the bottom of the bumper, we have some more changes going on there and twin exhaust tips on the passenger side. Toyota continues to be very aggressive when it comes to including active driver assistance technologies on even the base trims of their vehicles. So as with pretty much every Toyota vehicle on sale in North America right now, you'll find features like radar adaptive cruise control, forward collision warning, autonomous braking, lane centering, etc., all standard on the Highlander. A number of years ago, this was a bit more of a differentiator between the Highlander and some of the competition, but now most mainstream brands have followed Toyota's lead and are also including a lot of those same active safety technologies on their base trims. But you will find some of the competition that doesn't even include all of these technologies optional, so definitely keep that in mind if those are things that you're interested in. The one thing the XSE model does not get, however, is more power. Under the hood, we find the same 3.5-liter V6 engine that we find in the rest of the Highlander V6 lineup. This produces 295 horsepower, and it's mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission. All-wheel drive is optional, and that is the model that I'm taking a look at today. One nice touch is that the XSE borrows the same torque vectoring all-wheel drive system that we find in the Limited and Platinum models, so the all-wheel drive system in the XSE Limited and Platinum is different than the rest of the all-wheel drive Highlander lineup. As with the regular Highlander all-wheel drive, there's a clutch pack that connects the transmission to the rear differential. When engaged, it can send up to 50% of engine power to the rear axle, assuming there's no wheel slip up front. If there was wheel slip up front, it'd be able to send a bit more power to the rear. What's different about this setup is the rear axle itself. Inside the rear axle, it has some additional clutch pack units, so it can effectively disconnect one of the wheels whenever it wants to, or basically lock them together as well. It gives this vehicle essentially limited slip rear differential functionality as well as torque vectoring. So 50% of the engine power can be sent to the rear, and then that 50% can be sent to a single outside rear wheel. Now, this is a little bit different than Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system because the Highlander will never overdrive the rear axle like we see in Hondas and Acuras with their setup. That's why those systems claim to send up to 70% of engine power to a single rear wheel, assuming no wheel slip up front, and it's essentially going to be 50% in something like the Highlander. So this system is a little bit closer to the torque vectoring systems that we find in some Ford and some General Motors vehicles, although it is worth noting that GM doesn't like to call it torque vectoring because apparently by the strictest SAE definition, it actually isn't in this vehicle since the rear axle is not going a little bit faster than the front, like we find in super handling all-wheel drive. But it still has a pretty significant impact on handling performance in the Highlander, and you will certainly notice the difference if you drive this back to back with some of the lesser Highlanders that have the regular all-wheel drive system. I found the front seats to be pretty comfortable for my body shape, although I do wish the lumbar support was a four-way variety because it does hit me a little bit low on the back. We have a tilt telescopic steering column, and in this model, a power passenger seat as well. For this generation of the Highlander, Toyota applied the same formula that has made the Highlander a success for decades. A comfortable second row, a comfortable and wide third row. That's one of the reasons you might want to upgrade from something like a RAV4 into this, is the width of the second row for accommodating adults or child seats, and then more of an occasional use third row in the back rather than a a full-time third row. So if you do plan on having people back there in the way back all the time, you might want to take a look at the new Sienna minivan. The second row seats slide forward and backward, and the Highlander is available with either captain's chairs or a bench depending on the trim. Over here on the right side, the front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I still have a decent amount of legroom, and I could very easily scoot this seat forward or backward to apportion space a little bit more equitably with the third row. We also get some built-in window shades back here. Getting into the third row is pretty easy. We have these manual tilt slide second row seats, and the third row seats are pretty light, so kids or older people shouldn't have too much of a problem getting those seats back into position. And we do have a reasonable amount of legroom as long as you're willing to apportion space equitably between the front, second, and third rows. With 109 combined inches of legroom, you will find 8 inches more in some of the large 3-row crossovers. And that's why my knees are definitely digging into this seat back. You'll also find options out there with more headroom and definitely more thigh support as well. If I move that seat back there to a more comfortable position, you'll notice that my legs are pretty high off the ground and my head is sort of bopping this part of the ceiling where the center seat belt is coming out of. A touch that some folks really love about the Highlander is that this is an 8 or a 7 passenger vehicle. So even in this form, with this relatively small bench in the back, we have 3 seat belts back here. This particular model seats 7, 2 up front, 2 in the middle, and 3 in the way back. If you get the 8-passenger model, then we'd have a bench seat in the middle. That makes this notably more practical than a number of the options out there, which are either 6 or 7-passenger vehicles. But again, keep in mind that this rear bench seat is pretty small. Third row passengers get some hard plastic armrests with 2 cup holders on either side. We have well-placed air vents in the ceiling for the second row and the third row, and if I look back there just above that passenger side third row passenger headrest, you can see really that odd location of that center seatbelt. It's just over that person's head. Cargo capacity in the Highlander is about average. Behind this hatch we find 16 cubic feet of storage space, but in this generation Highlander they've made the cargo area a little bit squarer than in the previous version, and that does mean it's a little bit more accommodating when it comes to my 24-inch roller bag test. Of course, most folks will keep the rear seats folded most of the time to use this as additional cargo area. Toyota has an available rear cargo mat right here that has sort of an accordion section, mounts to the rear seat back. That's a really nice touch. As we see in a number of the competition, under the load floor we find some additional storage space, and this is where Toyota keeps the tire iron. The spare tire is completely under the vehicle. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that XSE is slotted between XLE and Limited in the trim line of the Highlander. So we have a pretty standard sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. We have height adjustable shoulder belts and height adjustable headrests. This vehicle has the soft tex and fabric option for the upholstery. Again, red leather is available, and that would certainly be my preference. I really like the way the red leather looks. It has a sort of a two-tone red and black leather look going on the interior. It really gives the Highlander XSE a very distinctive appearance in this segment. Again, I'm really sad that Toyota didn't send me one of those. But back to this model, you'll see that we have relatively minor bolstering on the seat bottom and back cushion, so larger folks shouldn't have any problem with these seats. Other than really the design of the upholstery, these seats are essentially the same as the ones that we find in the rest of the Highlander lineup. The red upholstery also helps break up the sea of charcoal tones that we find in this particular trim. On the doors, we find a mixture of hard and soft touch plastic, so soft touch armrest right there, soft touch bits right there around where your elbows and knee will bash, and then harder plastics on the center of the door and then down there towards the bottle holder and the speaker grills. The upper portion of the dashboard is a soft touch injection molded unit. We then have some trim that looks like knurled metal, and then at the bottom of that we have some stitched goods that really dress things up a lot. Toyota also gives us a ton of different storage areas. You can see that my smartphone is in that area right there. You could definitely easily keep some passenger phones and other knickknacks in there. Below that we have a moderately sized bin-style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a 10-inch tablet inside there. On second thought, I believe that they're trying to go for a carbon fiber look with this trim. Any way you slice it, it rolls across the dashboard and kind of reminds me of a robot claw, the way that it forks on either side of this large infotainment screen in the middle of the dashboard. Now, rather unfortunately, the XSE trim does not get the even larger touchscreen that we find available in the top 2 trims of the Highlander. I was really sad about that. I kind of hoped that that would work its way down to some less expensive trims over time, but instead we get the same screen that we find in the base model with some physical buttons on either side, smartphone integration as you can see right there in the middle. Below that we have the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control system, front 2 zones, and then the rear zone right there, 2 large air vents, More storage compartments going on here. There's one where you could, again, easily keep a smartphone. And there's also a cable pass-through, so you don't have to have this cable dangling around there if you don't want to. But personally, I'm a little bit lazy, I think. We then have a USB input for the infotainment system, 2 USB charge-only ports, and a 12-volt power port. There's also a large storage area right there where you could keep another smartphone if you wanted to. Lots of smartphone cubbies here. A pretty conventional console shifter with a manual mode over to the left. 2 large cup holders right there, electric parking brake, auto brake hold. These are the drive mode selector switches and knob. We have one over here for the sport mode, normal mode, and eco mode. We then rotate this one around for rock and dirt, mud and sand, press it down for normal, stability and traction control, a snow mode there, hill descent control, and then auto start, stop, enable, disable. Between the front seats, we find a center console with a roller style cover. This section actually bends. One thing about this is that this section is pretty soft, but we do find some hard seams. Basically, where these sections meet, we have ribs of hard plastic, so definitely keep that in mind if you have more delicate elbows. Under that, we have a Qi wireless charging mat. That's why you didn't see it up front. That folds out of the way to reveal a very, very large storage area where you could easily keep a gallon of milk if you can squeeze it through here. On the driver's side, we have a partial LCD instrument cluster that gives us things like infotainment readout, status of the all-wheel drive system, even the seat belt positions right there in the vehicle. And this is where you would change the behavior of some of the vehicle's active safety systems. We get the same round steering wheel we find in the rest of the Highlander lineup. One thing that surprised me is that we don't have paddle shifters on the back. I think that would have been a nice addition for the XSE. On the right side of the steering wheel, we find the buttons for the radar adaptive cruise control along with the lane keeping assistance button. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find buttons that control that multifunction LCD along with the phone button, and then the infotainment buttons are divorced on the right and left sides of the wheel. Logically, since we don't have any extra power on tap, 0 to 60 happened in the same 7.2 seconds as the last Highlander V6 that I tested, and stopping distances are essentially the same as well, 118 feet from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's because even though we have unique wheels in the XSE, the tires remain the same, and the curb weight of the XSE is pretty comparable to the limited trim and the XLE on either side. When it comes to handling, there is an improvement in the XSE. It's not enormous, but it is noticeable if you drive this back to back with the other Highlander models. The XSE feels a little bit sharper, a little bit more in tune with the driver, I guess for lack of a better word. The turn-in feels a little bit better, but again, we're talking about shades of gray here. The bigger thing most of you will notice versus the XLE is the torque vectoring rear axle. If you're in a corner like that and you floor it, you will definitely notice the vehicle rotating around the corner more elegantly than in the XLE model, a little bit more like the Limited and Platinum. But the slightly firmer suspension we find in the XSE just works and fits with that better in my opinion. Now this won't give you the same kind of rear rotation that you get in an Acura MDX with super handling all-wheel drive, but it is definitely a noticeable improvement over the rest of the front-wheel drive competition. This is certainly going to be more dynamic than something like the Hyundai Palisade or the Kia Telluride with their more traditional all-wheel drive setup. And you will notice some difference between the drive modes in this vehicle, because in the sport mode it's going to be much more aggressive at sending power to the rear. In the normal and eco mode, it actually is going to leave that rear axle disconnected for a wide variety of different operational speeds. If you were concerned that the XSE suspension tweaks would make this vehicle unlivable for daily commuting, fear not, that's not what Toyota's about. This is not a 7-passenger Supra. So although I'm going to drop the ride score down to an A-, I have to say that I think I prefer the ride tuning in this to the regular Highlander. Yes, you will feel more of those small imperfections into the cabin, more of those large imperfections as well. I'm willing to give that up for the increase in sharpness that we find in the XSE suspension tune. So even though the changes are relatively modest versus the regular Highlander, you will notice them driving them back to back, and this is the model that I would prefer. As far as mid-size 3-row crossovers go, this has a pretty quiet cabin, 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, so I'm certainly going to give this an A. When it comes to fuel economy, I'm going to have to drop the Highlander V6 score down to a B-. I've been averaging 19.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. That's pretty comparable to the bulk of the competition. But on second thought, after having really thought about this segment more, the Highlander Hybrid just makes so much sense that everything else in this segment needs to drop at least half a score down. Because if you want to get a 3-row vehicle that's not a minivan like the Sienna minivan, which does get exceptional fuel economy, and you want to get nearly 40 mpg, the Highlander is basically your only option. And there really aren't too many sacrifices for that Highlander Hybrid. You can still get all-wheel drive if you want to. Admittedly, it's all-wheel drive. It's not going to be as dynamic or as capable as this all-wheel drive system, but it does have it. And you get a relatively similar kind of 0 to 60 performance. It is going to be slower than this, but the difference is not enormous. But the fuel economy That's nearly double. I realize I'm not supposed to be talking about a Highlander hybrid at the moment because I am driving a Highlander XSE, but it's going to be sitting right there on the same dealer lot as the XSE, and as much as I like the suspension tune and the way this feels on the road, it certainly is more dynamic than the hybrid model. I have to admit, I'm a little cheap, and I might just buy that hybrid. Back to this XSE though, the XSE trim does not turn this into an Acura MDX with a cheaper price tag, especially if we're talking about the upcoming Acura MDX A-Spec. That's not what Toyota had in mind when creating this vehicle. They were just looking to give it a little bit of extra sport, a little bit of extra fun, sharper styling, more distinctive looks, etc. And that apparently is what they estimate 12% of shoppers are going to be interested in. So be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, especially if you're shopping for a Highlander. Is the XSE on your shopping list? Now let's dive into the pricing. For 2021, the Highlander starts at $34,910. Remember that the Highlander is on the small side of the three-row crossover segment. So if you want something bigger on the inside, there are things like the Telluride and Palisade, but they're not the most direct competitor to the Highlander. In many ways, the Sorento is the Highlander's direct competitor. However, there really aren't very many options when we start taking a look at sportier vehicles, like the XSE that I was driving. The XSE isn't simply a looks better package, there are also some suspension improvements in order to make it feel a little sportier as well. The XSE lives in the middle of the price range for the Highlander. It starts at $41,505. And it's the only one that doesn't have that chrome bar up front, sort of wing looking around the Toyota logo. You can get it with or without all-wheel drive. Personally, I would get the all-wheel drive version because it does have Toyota's torque vectoring all-wheel drive system. And interestingly enough, you can get the red leather interior with the red paint option. For some reason, a number of car companies out there, if they have a red interior, they won't combine it with the red exterior for some reason because they think it's too much red. I think that's nonsense. Toyota has done the right thing, and you can get the red interior with any exterior color. Unfortunately, the only other option available on the XSE is the JBL Premium Audio System. You can't combine any of the luxury features that we find on the Limited and the top-end trims of the Highlander onto the XSE, and I do think that's a bit of a pity. I would love to see a version of the XSE with more of an everything's option package so you could get some of those luxury features in the Limited or in the Platinum trim, especially the bigger LCD infotainment system combined with the sportier features of the XSE and of course the red interior. Now let's move on to the competition. The most direct competitor is obviously the Honda Pilot. The Pilot and the Highlander have been gunning for one another for decades. Starting at $32,550, the Pilot is less expensive than the Highlander for this year, but there is no corollary to the XSE trim, interestingly, so there's no sport package available on the Pilot at this time. But if you get all-wheel drive, you do get torque vectoring, and it's a more aggressive torque vectoring system than we find in the Toyota. Honda essentially uses their version of the Acura Super Handling all-wheel drive system in their vehicles with all-wheel drive in this size segment. So we find that on the Ridgeline, on the Pilot, and the new Passport. The big thing to know about Honda's all-wheel drive system is that it is capable of overdriving the rear axle, making those rear wheels spin a little bit faster than the front, something that Toyota's system cannot do. If you're out on a gravel or other slippery surface, say snow or ice, and you crank the steering wheel and you floor it, you'll definitely notice more of a rotation in the Pilot than in the Highlander, but the Highlander steering and the suspension, everything else I think is just dialed in a little bit better than in the Pilot. But it's not overbearing, it's not SRT firm like we find in some Chrysler or FCA products. That shouldn't be too surprising, of course, because the Highlander is new and the Pilot has been around for quite some time, and we expect to see a new Pilot perhaps later this year or early next year. Before we move on, one thing you should know about the Pilot is that for 2021, all models use the ZF 9-speed automatic. Some folks dislike the way that shifts, and shifts in the Highlander are always going to feel very normal because it uses an Aisin 8-speed automatic, the same one we see in a variety of different Toyota products. It's a perfectly normal 8-speed auto. Next up, we have the Ford Explorer, not because it has a trim that is a direct corollary to the XSE, but because all versions are fairly sporty thanks to its rear-wheel drive layout. The Explorer has gone back to rear-wheel drive, and it now borrows basically its entire drivetrain from the Ford Ranger. It has the same 2.3-liter turbo 4-cylinder engine producing a healthy amount of power and gobs of torque. It has the same 10-speed automatic that we find in the F-150 as well. This combination is part of why the Explorer has some of the higher tow ratings in this segment and definitely tows really, really well. If you're interested in a hybrid, there's also a hybrid Explorer available, although the fuel economy is certainly not as high as the Highlander hybrid. And if you're really interested in a sport model, there is a twin-turbo V6 available. You'll find that in the ST and in the very top-end trims of the Explorer, and that is definitely one of the swiftest three-row vehicles in this segment. However, the ST really isn't an XSE corollary because it starts at $52,830, basically right around where the Highlander stops. One last thing to keep in mind is that the Explorer, even though it's larger on the outside, it's not quite as big as you might think on the inside, and that's simply due to the rear-wheel drive layout. It's not as space efficient as a front-wheel drive layout, so definitely keep that in mind. Things shrank a little bit on the inside versus the previous generation Explorer. Next up, we have the Mazda CX-9, long one of the sportier options in this segment. It has a standard turbocharged engine, but it has a 6-speed automatic transmission, and that is definitely not my favorite transmission in this segment. You'll definitely find faster shifts in the Toyota 8-speed automatic that we find in the Highlander, and the CX-9 doesn't have a torque vectoring rear axle, so depending on exactly what you're doing, the Highlander may actually feel a little bit sportier. But the CX-9 has a really excellent precision to it. I love the way the suspension is tuned, the steering is definitely very, very well done, and the CX-9 has strangely wide tires for a base model. All CX-5s have 255 width tires. Tire size alone does not define handling, but because the CX-9 was designed to accept wider tires, if you wanted the ultimate in front-wheel drive handling in this segment, you could put some really wide, really grippy tires in the CX-9 a little bit more easily than you could on the Pilot or the Highlander that weren't designed for tires that wide to begin with. Now, a lot of folks dislike the CX-9 because they think that the interior is cramped, but when you really look at the numbers and you actually measure them out, put identical cargo in each vehicle, you'll notice that inside the CX-9 is very similarly sized to the Highlander. The form of the vehicle, however, is a little bit different. Thanks to Mazda's new design language, the CX-9 is pretty big on the outside. It's almost Durango-sized, but on the inside, it definitely is Highlander-sized. The CX-9 will give you actually a little bit less rear headroom in the third row and a tiny bit less cargo space than the Highlander, but most of the measurements are honestly very, very similar. As far as the competition for the XSE, to be perfectly honest, I think that's where this list stops. You could get something like a V6 version of the Dodge Durango for a similar price point to the XSE at $41,505. You might even be able to get a 5.7-liter V8 if you get a good deal at the dealer, but it's never going to be quite the same thing as the Highlander. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what would your pick be if you were looking for a family hauler that had just a little bit of extra sportiness to it? Honestly, I think the XSE is going to be an excellent option if that's something that you're looking for, because again, we get that torque vectoring rear axle, we get the red interior, which I really think looks really, really good in the Highlander. I love the fact that Toyota's been giving us more red interiors across their lineup. I hope that trend continues, because so many options out there are just an endless sea of black, or maybe you'll get a little bit of beige or grayish, whatever they want to call it, in some of the base trims. But most often, the vehicles you'll find on the dealer lots have black or charcoal interior, black or charcoal leather, black dashboards, black doors, etc. And you can definitely get something that's a bit spicier in the Highlander. Let me know what you think about that. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos, over at Instagram. You can see what I'm driving this week over at those social media channels. And I'll see all of you later.